Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Workplace Safety North webinar, New Health and Safety Research on Ontario Silviculture Industry. My name is Paige Jones, and I'm the event specialist here at Workplace Safety North. We appreciate your attendance here today and want to mention a few housekeeping items before we get started. Your microphones have been muted, and we ask that you use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen for speaker questions. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical issues using the Zoom application, do let us know in the chat box and we'll do our best to help you. Please note this webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording, a copy of the presentation, and resource information will be sent to you within the next few days. Today we are joined by Sabrina Mazer from Workplace Safety North. I'll invite Sabrina on screen to start today's presentation. Thanks.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Again, my name is Sabrina Mazer. I am a health and safety specialist with Workplace Safety North based in the Thunder Bay area. I do want to thank you all for joining today's webinar, and we do hope that you leave today with some information and resources to take back to your workplaces. An outline of what we'll be covering in today's session. So I am going to start with what the risk assessment project looks like and how we use the James Reason's accident causation model and how it applies to our risk assessment projects. We'll get into a quick overview of what the workshop process looks like and all those involved. We'll look at the risk assessment results, particularly the top 10 risks identified through that risk assessment workshop that was held back in March of 2023. And then an overview of the contributing factors and the infographic that has already been shared via our social media channels. We're then going to move into an overview of the root cause analysis workshop, our risk statement, and take a closer look at the fishbone diagram that was done as part of our 2-day session. And then this is going to lead us into our top 10 primary causal factors that were voted on and curated into a separate infographic for the sector. And lastly, we are going to touch on a second root cause analysis that was conducted as a result of a lot of discussion with those involved, and then the next steps to support the sector moving forward. So just looking at the risk assessment project, we base our risk assessment projects on James Reason's accident causation model. For those of you that don't know, it is shown up on the screen there. It really shows the various controls that should be in place to prevent an incident from taking place at a workplace. When there is simultaneous failure of these defenses or absence of risk controls, it can lead to a catastrophic event. And that can be something like a high hazard near miss all the way up to a fatality. Now, the goal of the risk assessment process is really to identify what risk is posed to workers, what controls are or aren't in place or working as intended, and collectively determine recommendations that can support the reduction of these failures from occurring to protect worker health and safety. Now, the workshop. So for the silviculture sector, we did make a call out to industry to request participation from workers and management within the sector to really provide that boots on the ground lens and their experiences of the hazards that they feel pose the greatest risk to workers. We ask those who choose to participate to go back to their workplace and have discussions with their colleagues and ask the question, what keeps you up at night with respect to workplace health and safety? Now, these risks are then all brought back to the larger group and voted on to determine the top 10 events or risks for the sector. Once that top 10 is determined, they're further analyzed and prioritized to help determine which risk goes through a 2-day root cause analysis. Now, our goal with any industry risk assessment that we facilitate is that the workshop is open, it's transparent and collaborative amongst the group of participants. We always strive to make sure that our industry experts feel heard and respected throughout the entire process. Now, although WSN facilitates the risk assessment and root cause analysis sessions, the real information and decisions are drawn from our industry experts. So I do want to thank any of our worker or management representatives who have joined us today or at any point throughout the entire process for taking the time out of your busy schedules to support this initiative that will directly support the silviculture sector and its workforce. Now, getting into our risk assessment workshop results. So here are the top 10 risks that were identified by worker and management representatives at our risk assessment session in March of 2023. Now, there were approximately 34 risks brought forward by the workers and management participants at the workshop. And those were voted on by only the worker and management participants to determine this top 10 that you see right here. Now, environmental hazards, particularly those relating to dead snag trees, chicos, spring poles, and wind events, were identified by the group as the top risk. Now, what's important to highlight here is that rank number 1, 5, 6, and 8 were all related to environmental hazards. And in a few slides, we're going to look at the contributing factors that were all very similar for these 4 events. Another important thing to note from this is that numbers 2, 3, 4, and 7 were related to driving hazards. And again, when we look at the contributing factors, we're able to identify that 4 of those 4 events, the driving that were all driving related, they all had similar contributing factors again. Now, because of the fact that both environmental and driving related events made up much of the top 10, there was a lot of discussion with the group around which risk to focus on for the root cause analysis. Breaking it down a little further into the pie chart that you're going to see up on the screen, I mentioned that both driving related and environmental hazards made up most of the top 10, and you're going to see it here. So both making up 40% each. And I don't want to lose sight, there was mention of ergonomics and then of course emergency preparedness, both taking up 10% each as well. Now, I have mentioned a lot about the contributing factors, and this is a really important thing to note here. So contributing factors to each risk category was reviewed to identify consistencies across those events. Now, focusing in on environmental related events that were captured in the top 10 risks, some of the common factors were related to lack of information, instruction, supervision, forest management planning requirements, danger trees left unidentified, production targets, working alone, the remoteness of the work, and working in areas of animal activity. But the group didn't want to lose sight of the fact that driving hazards also contributed 40% of the top 10 risks. And when we look at the contributing factors for those 4 events identified in the top 10, driving related events had the following consistent contributing factors. So we had distracted driving, inexperience, speeding, wildlife, lack of adherence to CVOR, lack of or no signage on the roads, hours of work, etc. Now, the group was made aware that some work had been done through the logging sector risk assessment with respect to driving hazards, particularly highway driving being a focus. However, we know that silviculture presents some uniqueness with respect to passenger vehicles on highways and forest roads. So things like using buses, passenger vans, crummies, etc. And the group did feel that it would be beneficial to conduct a second and separate root cause analysis specific to driving hazards and the use of passenger vehicles on highways and forest roads. Now, because of this, the working group decided that environmental hazards would be the risk category for the initial root cause analysis, which is going to be our focus for today's webinar. We're also going to discuss the driving root cause analysis very briefly at the end of the webinar, but I do want to remind everyone that the technical report will provide more information on that second root cause analysis. So we'll continue working through the information related to environmental hazards. Next up, we'll show you the infographic. So this should also look familiar. It has been shared through our social media channels to make others aware of the top 10 risks identified in the silviculture sector in 2023. It's also available on our website, along with the other resources that are relevant to this project. Please feel free to utilize these resources within your workplace and share them amongst your colleagues within the sector. So just looking at our root cause analysis workshop and those who did participate, so you will see on the left-hand side our subject matter experts, so both worker and management representatives. And then on the right-hand side, you are going to see participants from the workshop from Workplace Safety North and the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. Now, because of the consistencies across the 4 environmental risks, the group decided to work through that category for the root cause analysis session in November 2023. A risk statement was developed by the group, and it is highlighted in bold on the screen there. Environmental factors, including exposure to danger trees, wind and weather events, temperature extremes, and wildlife, can have negative impact on workers. Now, this risk statement incorporates all of the environmental events within the top 10, because again, they were all very closely linked with their contributing factors, so it was appropriate to capture them all. Looking next at the fishbone diagram, so we use that risk statement to come back to for clarity as we move through the fishbone diagram and its factors of people, environment, process, measures, tasks, and machines, and culture. And on the next slide, you're going to see the entire fishbone diagram. So it did end up looking something like this, with our primary causal factors identified in black, secondary factors identified in blue, tertiary factors in green, and in some cases, we were even able to dig a little bit deeper and we would find quaternary factors in red. Now you can also see that some black boxes are outlined in orange, and those specific factors are identified and they were voted on to be in the top 10 causes. Now we are going to look at a breakdown of each of the factors, starting with the people factor. So a lot of discussion was had around the people factor of the diagram during our 2-day session. Some things to note here for your primary causes was lack of retention, competitive factors, personal health conditions, worker attitudes, limited recognition of environmental hazards influenced by fatigue and cognitive demands were identified as your primary causes. With secondary, tertiary, and again, in some cases, we were able to get those quaternary causes as well. Now, as we work through these elements of the fishbone diagram, again, those items that are outlined in black, capitalized, and have that orange border were voted on and became part of your top 10 root causes. Now, from the people category, the limited recognition of environmental hazards stemming from things like fatigue and competitive factors like wages and quality of camp life, resulting in that constant turnover in the sector, increasing the amount of new and inexperienced personnel who are unaware of pertinent environmental hazards, were voted by management and worker representatives and identified in the top 10 root causes. Looking next at environment. So when we work through the environmental causes, things like time of year, increase in forest fires, working closely to wildlife food sources, remoteness of the work, and FMP guidelines, forest management plan guidelines, resulting in increase in danger trees were also highlighted. Again, from the environmental factor, you're going to see those two black boxes at the top of the screen highlighted in an orange. So that forest management planning requirements and then the remoteness of the work were identified and voted to be in the top 10. Looking next at culture. So a lot of discussion around culture, specifically culture of camp life. So the effectiveness of supervisors to enforce safety, lack of sector-specific guidelines and resources, along with limited collaboration resulting in outdated or ineffective measures and procedures, and an overall ineffective sector culture due to things like lack of funding, contract selection, lack of retention were also highlighted. Again, what's interesting here is you're going to notice two more factors, primary factors, were voted to be in the top 10. So again, those ones outlined in orange, the lack of sector-specific guidelines and resources and lack of collaboration, and then the culture of the camp life in tree planting, compromising the effectiveness of our supervisors, were both voted to be in the top 10. So far, with the three factors we've gone through, people, environment, and culture, we've identified 6 within the top 10. Looking next at measures. So discussion here around outdated and effective measures and procedures, which you've probably already started to notice. These have been outlined in some of the other factors we've already reviewed. Lack of contingency planning, lack of ministry oversight were identified within the top 10 root causes. All of those, again, you're going to see 5 on the screen for primary factors, but 2 again were identified and voted to be in the top 10 for root causes. So that subjective interpretation and implementation of procedures leading to the inconsistencies in the sector application when working around danger trees and during wind and weather events. And then again, that IRS, so internal responsibility system, being impacted by limited sector-wide oversight, both by internal and external stakeholders. And then looking over at process. So process discussions revealed primary causes of underestimation of wildlife exposures, inadequate processes or training, and identified in your top 10 root causes was the variable weather conditions that we're seeing, walk-in sites, and lack of or inconsistent sector-based standards and guidelines, resulting in that subjective application of emergency response plans during weather-related events, and inconsistent risk assessment processes addressing environmental factors across the sector. So across the 5 factors we've looked at so far, 2 within each of those factors were voted to be in the top 10. Again, you're going to see on the screen there, those 2 outlined in orange were voted and placed within the top 10. Now, lastly, we talked about tools and machines. What's interesting here, there was a lot of discussion around tools and machines, but none of the primary factors did make it into the top 10. Not an issue. We still want to give them the respect they deserve. So there was discussion around lack of PPE, personal protective equipment, inefficient communication tools due to inadequate technology and the high cost associated with them, lack of measurement equipment, improper or poor maintenance of equipment, and lack of protection for overhead hazards due to the impracticality of it. So again, none of the tools and machines factors were voted into the top 10, but again, not an issue. And as noted, there were a lot of similar themes throughout each factor. So you probably were able to pick up on some, but we know that inconsistencies across like the application, maybe the lack of measures and procedures, et cetera, et cetera. Now, upon completion of the fishbone diagram, the management and worker representatives who participated in the root cause analysis session were the only ones who were able to vote to determine the top 10 primary causal factors. And we're going to have that shown up on the screen in just a second here. So here are your top 10 primary root causes to incidents related to environmental hazards. Now you have the remoteness of the job, lack of considerations on extreme weather, FNP requirements, no consistent procedures across the sector, poor enforcement, the outdated or ineffective measures and procedures, lack of experience of workers in the sector, inconsistent risk assessment processes, lack of management presence during such events, and even fatigue. So again, of those 6 factors, 5 of them, so your environment, process, measures, culture, people, those are the ones that did capture the top 10. We did develop a infographic for our top 10 root causes, and this is going to be new. You will be able to find this on our website, and Paige will be sharing this resource with the group that was able to attend the webinar today. Again, please feel free to utilize this resource in discussions with your workplace and amongst your colleagues within the sector. So our goal as a group at the root cause analysis session was to determine what causes are contributing to our top risk of environmental hazards or weather events, and identify controls and/or activities that can control this risk from negatively affecting workers and others. A technical report has been developed to highlight the previously discussed information, and it's also going to include the top 10 root causes with the inclusion of the recommendations made by the group at the root cause analysis session. That report will be made available for you to review. It's going to be accessible on our website. Again, Paige is going to share that resource with you as well. But as much as we would have loved to highlight all of the recommended controls for the top 10, it would have been a lengthy webinar. So we do ask that you review that information. And if you do have any questions, reach out to myself, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Looking next at another infographic. So at the beginning of the session, I mentioned that driving hazards captured 40% of the top 10 risks, and that the 2023 logging sector risk assessment had focused on driving hazards. Our group, again, there was a lot of discussion. We did want to look particularly at driving hazards with a focus on passenger vehicles as it relates to the silviculture sector. Again, with the use of buses, passenger vans, crummies, etc. So here is a look at the top 10 root causes of passenger vehicle driving hazards. Again, this was another 2-day root cause analysis session with a few other participants that were able to participate in that session. And again, the technical report that will be available to you will actually break down the fishbone diagram to showcase the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary causes, and ultimately those that led to the top 10 causes that are outlined here, voted on by worker and management representatives that were able to participate in that root cause analysis. Okay. As for next steps, WSN, Workplace Safety North, we understand the role that we play in supporting the sector, and we recognize many of the recommendations shared by the working group at the root cause analysis were really related to advancing leading practices and standards and promoting consistency of these practices across the sector. Because of this, Workplace Safety North will be working with industry to establish a silviculture advisory committee that will invite participation from industry experts directly from the sector, so both worker and management representatives, and others who support the sector. So there will be representatives from Workplace Safety North, perhaps the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. We'll extend membership to licensees, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's within that group that our recommendations through our technical report will be shared to action as they see fit. Now, I have mentioned the establishment of a silviculture advisory committee. If anyone on this call is interested in participating on that advisory committee, please reach out via email to express your interest. My email will be available on the next slide and on the webpage with the resources from today's session. Now, a lot of work was done by our worker and management representatives over the course of almost a year. So again, I do want to take a moment to thank each and every one of them who participated in some way, shape, or form. Without the perspectives of our workers and our management personnel within the sector, we wouldn't be able to do this. I will open it up to the group for any questions that you may have following that extensive amount of information. Paige, I see you up on the screen.
Thanks, Sabrina. I just want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. It doesn't look like we have any questions at this time, so just a reminder to the attendees, if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A section at the bottom. While we wait a few moments, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, folks, so I do ask that you please take the time to review the webinar information and the accompanying resources like the infographics and technical report that will be made available to you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. But again, I do want to thank each and every one of you for taking time today to sit in on our webinar. It does mean a lot to us.
Thank you so much. It doesn't look like we have any questions, so we will give some time back to our audience. So I would just like to thank you for attending today's webinar, New Health and Safety Research on Ontario Silviculture Industry. A copy of the presentation and the recording will be emailed to you within the next few days and posted to the resources section of Workplace Safety North. Thanks again and have a safe day. Take care.